Morning, everybody. Afternoon in some countries, and maybe to some people, good evening. I'm Sharon Constanson. We're going to start now, and in respect to those that have arrived on time, and for many of you who arrived early, it's wonderful to see you all joining the South African Chamber of Commerce. I am Sharon Constanson. I'm chairman of the South African Chamber, and it is my honor to take the third event in our series of global citizenship, which is such a critical and important issue to all of us, and something I think post-COVID and post the pandemic, everybody is more impassioned about this issue than I think we've ever been before. So out of every dark thundercloud comes this little bit of lining or silver lining that comes to us. We're going to have a very, very interesting panel today. One in himself, Professor Petersen, who from now onwards I will refer to as Francis. He will introduce Professor Sachs, Jeff, to those of us who now know him. And we will now have, they will take you through. You're not going to be here to listen to me, but this is just one of the many things that we are doing in terms of supporting, providing information to our membership and to our associates and friends in the world. We've got people today from literally, I think, just about every single continent. So we are well populated in our audience. Well done for the draw card that the University of the Free State has achieved. This event today will be in conversation, so we will have the two gentlemen chatting, and then please, we do want your questions. Those will be picked up at the end. I will pick those up and I will put those questions either to Professor Petersen or Professor Sachs, whichever it is that you prefer, if you have a preference. If not, they will by default go to Professor Sachs. But please put the questions up. I will only pick them up towards the end. And in the meantime, Professor Petersen and Professor Sachs will enjoy conversation together. Professor Petersen, I'd like to just do a quick introduction. He is the Rector and Vice Chancellor of the University of the Free State. For those of us, or those of you who may not know, that is a university sitting slap bang in the middle of the South Africa country. If you had to find the middle point, I think you probably get pretty close to the university. He's been involved in the University of Cape Town. He's been involved with Anglo American. He's been involved with Mintech, and he's been involved with the Cape Peninsula Technikon. So he comes from both the academic, but also the research environment as well. He's got degrees in engineering and a PhD from Stellenbosch University, and he's done some additional work in financial skills, executive management, and in IIR training. He is the recipient of the Ernest Oppenheimer Memorial Trust and Cape Technikon Research of the Year Awards, and he's also a regular reviewer and serves on editorial panels of various international journals. I know him as a friend, a person I've had breakfast with on a number of occasions, and where we actually enjoy debating and sharing the sort of our concepts of the world. A man of eminent knowledge. I am totally humbled by his knowledge. I will stop at that point, Professor Petersen. Francis, I'd like you to take over, and I wish you both an enjoyable 45 minutes.
Right, thank you very much, Sharon. And I did say to you, I won't blush, but yeah, no, I think you've introduced, you've taken a little bit of a long step into my background. But thank you very much for that kind introduction. But today I'm actually quite honored to be having a conversation with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and Jeff is indeed an pleasure. To have this conversation with you, and also for your availability and for agreeing to be part of this conversation. I'm going to introduce Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, to you. Most of you would know Professor Sachs. I think he doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. So Professor Jeffrey Sachs is the president and of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Professor Sachs serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he holds the rank of professor, university professor, the university highest academic rank. Professor Sachs held the position of the director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University from 2002 to 2016. Professor Sachs is a commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and obviously where one would know him is the Sustainable Development Goal Advocate for the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, From 2001 to 2018, Professor Sachs also served as special advisor to the UN for UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. That was for the period 2001 to 2007. And then also for Ban Ki-moon, 2008 to 2016. And then obviously Antonio Guterres, 2017 to 2018. Now, Professor Sachs was the co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, the leading global prize for environmental leadership. He was twice named amongst the Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders, and has received over 35 honorary degrees. The New York Times called Professor Sachs as probably the most important economist in the world, and the Times magazine called Professor Sachs the world's best-known economist. Prior to joining Columbia University, Professor Sachs spent over 20 years as a professor of Harvard University, and most recently as the Galen L. Stone Professor of International Trade, a native of Detroit, Michigan. Professor Sachs received the BA, MA, and PhD degrees from Harvard universities. So I thought I wanted to give that background, Professor Sachs, just to give indication the caliber of person that we're going to have a conversation on this afternoon. Now, I want to start off the conversation, Professor Sachs, with trying to make the link with our conversations that we had a little bit earlier in this series about global citizen. And the way that I understand global citizen, and the way that I've defined global citizen in our conversations with Sharon before, and also with our Chancellor, was the global citizen is aware of and understand the what's happening in the world, in the broader world, and it's often also the values that those individuals have, the identity that those individuals bring into that context that is very crucial. And I want to use that as a starting point by talking about the pandemic. And I think the pandemic is obviously well known. That's on all of our minds. Doesn't really matter where you are in the world. But in the pandemic, it actually creates two issues that stands opposite one another. If you unpack the pandemic, the first one is what I would call nationalism or protectionism, where countries were more focusing on themselves to try to reduce probably, or try to make sure that their vulnerabilities are being looked after. And we also have seen that in the vaccine rollout and availability, and also distribution thereof. So that's the one part: nationalism, protectionism. On the other part, on the other side, we also have seen that and the pandemic has indicated the interconnectedness of the world, and for that, it's important that if what happened in one country or with one nation has got an impact on the other nation or the other country. And the pandemic have illustrated the fragility of humanity, and therefore countries and citizens in countries also have understood that collaboration, caring of one another, looking out for one another is quite important. And the whole issue of solidarity came into play. So you got this nationalism, protectionism versus the solidarity. And in the context of understanding of a global citizen, I probably would like to hear your thoughts. How would one bring across to our next generations that's probably sitting at our universities that will be populating the globe? How do you understand that sort of, not necessarily contradictions, but two poles? And what was the sort of message that you would give to them as a way of navigating into the complex world that we're living in?
First, let me say how nice it is to be together with you. Are you in Bloemfontein today, by the way?
No, I'm not in Bloemfontein today. I'm working remotely. So I'm in Cape Town. I'm actually in Cape Town today.
Okay, all right. Yes. But I'm in New York, and I know we have listeners all over the world, and it's nice that at least the digital age allows us to connect so naturally this way. One thing you may not know about my family is that we do have Bloemfontein connections, actually. So in our family history, and so it's especially nice to be with you. You know, the world's interconnected more intensely, more immediately, more dangerously in many ways than, of course, ever before in history. The fact that we can Zoom so naturally is one part of that. The fact that the pandemic could spread from an initial outbreak seems to be initially in China and then spread to the world within a matter of weeks is another measure of the interdependence. I have studied in the past the Black Death of Europe, which occurred in the 14th century in 1347, the outbreak in Italy. It seems that probably the virus originated in Asia, probably in what is today Western China, around 1331. And I just make the point, it took 16 years to spread to Europe at that point. In this pandemic, it took under 16 hours. It was somebody on an airplane. And people spread around the planet as they do for travel, for tourism, for work. And within weeks, we had a true pandemic. That means everywhere this disease is in outbreak. And more than that, we've learned with Delta, the variant that is sweeping the world right now and is extremely dangerous, alas, that a variant that emerges anywhere in the world can spread everywhere in the world. So not only did the SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, spread worldwide, but when a new variant evolves, it spreads worldwide as well. So anyone that thinks, well, I don't have to care about the rest of the world, you know, I'm just going to keep my walls up and keep my protection up, is extraordinarily naive. But here's the problem. The problem is, first of all, we don't have a natural instinct or impulse for global thinking, that's for sure. We are evolved as a species, human beings, for our localities. That's what we understand, our families, our neighborhoods, perhaps our cities, with some stretch, our countries, maybe a region, the African Union, and so on. But to think about the whole world is not easy. It takes a lot of good luck to be able to have some experience of the rest of the world. It takes a lot of work of knowledge building to see perspectives from other points of view. Now, another problem, though, is our politicians. They are elected locally, and they appeal to their local base. And this makes global understanding and cooperation extremely difficult. If the president of the United States, because of the influence of that position, were elected globally, we never would have had Donald Trump, for example, a crazy man who got in because he appealed to a part of the US population, but then he did huge damage all over the world, really nasty man. But the rest of the world doesn't have a say. And he had a policy called America First, which is a measure of that man's cruelty, by the way, because he is by nature an extremely selfish man. But then he had a selfish policy where he said, I don't care about the rest of the world, I care about America. And that also appealed to many Americans, by the way, you know, because it's easy to tell people in any country, you're being attacked or cheated by the rest of the world, and I'll protect you. And so many politicians not only don't understand the rest of the world, don't care about the rest of the world, don't want to cooperate with the rest of the world, but they play to power by making accusations about the rest of the world. So cooperation is very weak. And here we are in a world that is completely interconnected, completely vulnerable because we can't get our act together, not only on this pandemic, where the world's done a pretty miserable job, by the way, I have to say, in containing this pandemic, and our politicians generally have proven incompetent in doing this, but climate change. Even as we're fighting the pandemic, what's happening all over the world? Floods, droughts, hurricanes. I don't know what the weather's been in South Africa this winter for you, but it's been miserable for us in the Northern Hemisphere. We've had the hottest weather, unbelievable temperatures in the American Northwest that led to mega forest fires. We had early hurricanes starting in the Caribbean. There have been huge floods in China that claimed many lives, huge floods in India, massive heat waves. The planet is falling apart, because of human pressures. And what do the politicians do? Not that much, I have to say. We still don't have clarity about the global action. And climate change is just like the pandemic in that you don't make your own climate. If we all lived under our own bubble where we got to decide, I think we would take care of the global warming that we were causing. But what happens in the global climate is that any place that puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere affects the entire world, not just themselves. And so we have what the climate scientists call uniform mixing of the atmosphere. You put up the CO2 molecules by burning coal, oil, or gas, and within 30 days, they're distributed around the entire global atmosphere, changing the entire global climate. And then countries say, well, we don't want to act. And this, by the way, is especially true. It's true of South Africa. It's true of the United States. It's true of countries that have fossil fuels. South Africa has coal. The United States has everything, as usual.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And then we say, okay, it's not our fault. We don't, and people, the politicians make things up. The Australian prime minister is awful on this because Australia exports coal. They have Rupert Murdoch, the media magnate, who uses his media influence to bring down any politicians that try to take action against that money-making industry. And so this is our problem, Francis, that we're interconnected. We need cooperation, but instead we have an unfair world, a selfish world, and a short-sighted world. And time is running out, I'm afraid.
To look at that, Jeffrey. Now, I think that provides a extremely good background, and thank you for that. And I just wanted to say that I did pick up that there are family relations back into, or connections back into Bloemfontein and the Free State, and I also just wanted to say that I think it was in 2015 that our university conferred an honorary degree to you.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for that.
And that's fantastic.
But amazingly, in this interconnected world, my family, which is Jewish, was chased by the czars in Russia. And where did my grandfather go? He got on a steamer, ended up in, I think, the port of Durban, but made his way to Bloemfontein and then to Vicksburg. That's where my roots are. So it's quite amazing how interconnected we are.
It seems to me that all the great people come from the Free State province. But
there you go.
We can talk about that at some other time. Jeffrey, I want to move. I'll probably come back to 2 points that you've raised a little bit later. The one is on climate change, and who's responsible for that, and the other one is really about leadership. But I'll come back to that. But I just want to, just for a moment, stay with the pandemic, because one of the positives of the pandemic is the advancement of technology. How technology have excelled, and I think this is a very good example. You were in Europe, but we could have connected in Europe. You in the States. We've got Sharon in London. and we got people as part of the audience in all connection, all parts of the globe. So technology really have excelled. But through that, we also have seen a massive digital divide between specifically poor countries, where there is connectivity, where there's electricity, where there's access to devices. And it actually illustrated and showed and demonstrated how unequal the world really is. Now, I want to actually go back and say, well, the technology advances probably give a lot of impetus to our big tech companies, like Google and Amazon and Facebook, and you can carry on, Alibaba, Tencent, and so on. And they have benefited extensively. But is there a way in which the world, in which we could go to those companies and say, well, on the one hand, you've benefited. You obviously have done some work, but to a certain extent, the COVID have provided, from an industry perspective, I would say, a windfall to you. Is there a way in which that windfall could be utilized to bridge this divides that we have? And specifically, I'm not referring to the digital divide, because that's a link. Any thoughts from that side, Jeffrey?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my gurus, by the way, is Professor E.O. Wilson, who's a great biologist at Harvard University. And he has an expression. He says, we've entered the 21st century with Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies. And his point is that we operate at three different modes. Our human nature was formed on the savannah in Africa 200,000 years ago. Our institutions are perhaps hundreds of years old, but our technologies are changing by the day and accelerating. And we don't have a good synchronous management of our emotions and politics, our institutions, and our technologies. So the technology is far advanced, but we don't use them properly. We don't use them fairly. We don't deploy them for the common good. Vaccines is probably the most stark example. It's amazing that within a year, there were effective vaccines against COVID-19. But if you look today, I just looked at the latest count, in the United States, about half of the public is fully immunized. But in Africa, it's under 2%, because Africa's not gotten access. There was actually a global plan called COVAX to help developing countries get vaccinated. But you know what? The suppliers, the companies, they didn't give it to this UN organization. They made billions selling it to individual governments. And so the rich countries commandeered the vaccines. The poor countries are standing there saying, hey, what about us? We've been waiting. And now Delta is surging, and there still is no plan for vaccine distribution. And it really bothers me a lot. I'm chairing a commission, the Lancet Commission on COVID-19, so I'm looking at this closely. We have the means in global production to actually achieve comprehensive vaccine coverage, at least by early next year, but it's not going to happen the way it's going. The rich countries are saying, well, we don't know, maybe we're going to have a third dose or a fourth dose, or immunize the children, or do other things before even proper immunization takes place in the first round in Africa. And so I joined a call a couple of weeks ago, public call, saying we need at least 300 million doses emergency for Africa right now in this surge, but silence from the rich world. So you can make the call, but it's like calling into a void. And this is true across many technologies. By the way, it wasn't hard to see this coming. When the vaccine warp speed project came in the United States at the beginning of the epidemic, who knew whether we'd get a vaccine? But I did say to the leaders of that effort, We need a plan now of how this vaccine will be fairly distributed. That plan never was made. The vaccine was made, the vaccine was used, but the plan for fair global distribution was never made. And maybe I could raise a political point here that I'm also trying to push. One of the key places where decision-making is happening internationally these days is the G20. The G20 is, roughly speaking, the 20 large economies of the world. It includes 19 nations and the European Union. There's one country in Africa in the G20, that's South Africa. But all the rest of Africa, the other 1.3 billion people, are not sitting at the G20 table. And Africa doesn't really have the voice that it needs, because after all, there are 1.4 billion people in Africa. That's about the same size as India and China. But India and China, by being one nation, speak with a loud voice, whereas Africa, being actually 55 members of the African Union, does not. So I'm advocating that we expand the G20 to the G21. You know, if the European Union can have a chair as the Union, not as separate countries, why can't the African Union have a chair permanent at the front table in the G21 process? So I called for this at a UN meeting a few days ago. I'm going to really be pushing the point, because this would spur the vaccine coverage as well. This would spur the digital coverage as well. I'll mention one other thing. You know, the US is a very unfair country, unfair to the world, but really unfair internally also. We had apartheid in the United States for most of American history. We had slavery, and then we had 100 years of apartheid, and it's not really over. So that is still a battleground. And our income divide is huge. Our wealth divide is absolutely huge. And the wealthy in the United States don't want to help the rest. So just before our call, I was reading the Wall Street Journal editorial today opposing the new bipartisan infrastructure bill. And one of the pieces of the legislation that the Wall Street Journal doesn't like is that there's money for underserved communities to extend digital coverage. And the Wall Street Journal is the nastiest newspaper you can't even imagine. And it's owned by Rupert Murdoch, who's one of the nastiest people in the world. And when they wrote about underserved, they put it in quotation marks just to add to the nastiness, as if, oh, they're only quotation marks underserved. Because the Wall Street Journal sits down the block from me. I'm in Manhattan, and they're just a few blocks, and they're in their fancy building and in their fancy everything. And then they put quotation marks around underserved, and they say, why should we help the underserved? Because let the market do it. And it's just vulgarity. And that's part of the problem, because this is also American politics. And then America sits at the table. And President Biden is a very fine, nice man. I know him for a long time. He would love to do more for the world. But the Republicans in the Congress here are absolutely as nasty as that Wall Street Journal editorial. The idea that they would want to help the world, they couldn't even comprehend. Why the hell would we do that? And so this is really what we're up against. But just to come to your question, because I've just made a rant, to come to your question, of course we need to spend public money to close the digital divide. The digital technologies are so good. You can have school by digital, you can have healthcare by digital, you can have banking by digital, you can have entertainment by digital, you can have government services, your driver's license, anything by digital. And yet half the world doesn't have access. And so when you have this wonderful new technology and half the world doesn't have it, things don't stay the way they are, the inequality widens because the part that has this benefit just goes on to more and more wealth, more and more capacity, and the others become more and more invisible, actually. Not only do they suffer, but we don't see them. They're not on Zoom after all. When our New York City schools went online because of COVID, there were huge numbers of kids that could not go online because they didn't have a device. They didn't have coverage. They lived in a shelter. So many things. And this is New York City, home to 100 billionaires who, by the way, mostly are very selfish. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to do anything. So this is how the world is.
Yeah. So Jeffrey, I want to try to see whether we can fit in two more questions before I want to give Sharon an opportunity to also pick some questions from the floor. And the one question is probably related to some of the things that you mentioned in your response about the digital divide when you're referring to the G20. And by the way, I think it's a very good proposal to see whether we can expand to the G20 to G21. But you also referred to that the world response to this pandemic wasn't a good response. And if I want to make the statement that I believe that we have seen a failure in global institutions, probably the leadership in global institutions. So that is not only the G20, we're talking about the G7. I know your article about the G7 and your views.
Close it down.
Yeah. And there's the World Health Organization, there's the UN Security Council, and you can carry on. But I think there's an argument for reform. I don't think there's enough ambition in these institutions. And what would be your views on this? Because I think this is quite crucial.
I'm making the argument myself that we are at a pivotal moment, a hinge moment, not unlike the world in 1945 when the UN was created. The UN was created in the midst, in the shadow of World War II, that utter devastation, and in the context of a World War I, Great Depression, and World War II. So for 30 years between 1914 and 1945, complete disaster. We had a president then who was really a great man, Franklin Roosevelt, and he, during the war, said, we are going to create a post-war rule of law, international system. And he pushed for a United Nations system. And the UN was brought into effect in 1945. And with it, many important institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and others. That was a disaster period followed by real reform. Now, here we are today, facing the pandemic, where clearly the multilateral system fell down. Also, we had Trump, who not only was not a multilateralist, he wanted to break the multilateral system. So he took the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He took the US out of WHO, the World Health Organization, at the height of the pandemic. As I say, really a sick man, in my opinion. But he was the president of the United States. So the international system proved to be very fragile. And now I'm very unhappy about it, but the US is really trying to create a new Cold War with China, which to my mind is just about the last thing one should want to do right now. We should be reaching out saying, we need to cooperate. We need to cooperate to stop the pandemic. We need to cooperate to decarbonize the economy. We need to cooperate to help the developing countries get a foothold in this international system. We need to cooperate to extend 5G around the world. But the United States is more afraid of China then it understands the benefits of cooperation. So my argument is we should view 2021 in a way like 1945, where we need real institutional reform. And we have a president who's a very decent man and could see the way to this. We have the European Union with good leadership. I believe we could get cooperation with China. I think the African Union should be front at the table in the G21. And President Tshisekedi, who's chairperson of the African Union, could very ably represent Africa in this context. But we should be looking for basic reform, for fairness in the international financial system, for the ability of developing countries to tap capital to make investments, not at punishingly high interest rates, but at the near zero interest rates that the rich countries pay. When the US borrows right now 30 years, it's paying 1%. When Germany borrows, it's paying negative, actually. But if a developing country tries to go borrow for 30 years, it'll pay between 5 and 10% per year coupon rate. And that becomes an impossible debt burden. So we need financial reform. We need to make our system much more representative of people, like the G21 idea. We need to have universal vaccination. Obviously, that's for the most basic self-interest, stop new variants from emerging. And we need to have universal connectivity, because we have this great tool, but it will only be a tool of social progress if it's available to everybody. So that would be my argument, and I'm trying to put in my role in advising the UN as many specific financial ideas on the table to move us in that direction.
Yeah. Jeffrey, I want to ask a question, and this will be my sort of my last question to you, and then I'll give over to Sharon. It's a little bit of a controversial question, but I know that you like controversial views.
Absolutely.
So I think you would. So there's a school of thought that probably suggests that, and I'm not talking about climate change now here, that the Western countries, the Western world, the Western countries, that they really have been historically the culprits of climate change. But the biggest payers is going to be the poor countries, because they will have to find ways to deal with the impact of climate change, and they will have to fund the problem that they didn't create it in the first place. So if we argue from a justice perspective, we don't see that there's any social justice in that. We could probably even argue that there's no economic justice in it. But there is this obviously link with the SDGs, that we need to save the planet, and saving the planet is for all of us, and also to make sure that we save it for our children. But how would you navigate that debate, that sort of discussion, Jeffrey?
It's a great issue, and I think the key to getting it right is to separate two things. First, what should we do as a world for our safety? And then second, who should pay for it? So what we should do is we need to get out of fossil fuels ASAP. We need to move to a safe energy system now, because we're already in the midst of incredible climate disruption, and it's going to get worse. Everybody has to do it. We need to get to zero by 2050. But at the same time, two things. It's costly to make the transition. And second, there are going to be big disasters along the way, like we're seeing already: floods, droughts, hurricanes, much adaptation investment needed to keep the coastline safe, or to ensure safe water, or to protect against extreme storms, and so forth. So that's where historical responsibility really comes in. The United States is more responsible than any other country for the total carbon dioxide in the air. And the United States can't just say, well, that's too bad. It's not my responsibility. That is the responsibility of the US and the other emitting countries, that they need to cover costs. That's justice. If you were in a court of law and you sued the United States and said, you created this damage, now you have to pay for it. A judge in a tort system would say, yeah, you're liable. We don't have, unfortunately, that kind of global tort system. But if we did, I know who would be in the dock. And that is important. So what we need to do is not confuse two issues. Some developing country advocates say, look, we didn't cause it, so we don't need to make the change. That I don't think is right, because everybody has to make the change for safety. It would be like saying we didn't cause COVID, so we don't have to get vaccinated. No, that is not the right logic. The right logic is we're all going to decarbonize, but the United States and Europe and others that have a disproportionate responsibility, China, Russia, and others, need to foot a lot of the bill. And the rich countries, as usual, have been dragging their feet. It's absolutely horrible in the US, because if I come back to it, the Wall Street Journal would say, don't spend any money on it, which they've been saying for 30 years, that disastrous lying newspaper, because they pretended that we don't even have a crisis. But even those who say we do have a crisis say we spend it on ourselves, and they don't take into account what's happening. Even in our own neighborhood, the Caribbean is getting so hard hit by climate change, but so far the US is completely oblivious to it. So this is how we need to respond. It's part of that agenda of basic transformation. We need to put historical responsibility on the table. You don't just get to walk away from the past. Powerful people try to, but you shouldn't be able to. We need some truth and reconciliation, I would say, and that also means some financial co-responsibility.
Yeah. And I'm just hoping in the same sense as the pandemic, as sort of focus our mind how we should in fact work together to be able to deal with it. That same sort of urgency should be translated to the climate change crisis, and also the public health crisis in general. When because it's not only the pandemic, there's other parts of public health that also need to be focused on.
I think that people around the world feel this way, but the political leaders who look to their own power in local elections are probably the last to come on board. And we need to convince the politicians that we, the global citizens of the world, want global cooperation.
Absolutely. Jeffrey, I actually could carry on for another hour, and I think it's been so fantastic to deal with the challenges that I often say when we talk about global is not out there. Global is here. We're part of global, and it's been fascinating. And at some point we will continue this discussion if we could. Probably with another Zoom session, but if we will travel, I will definitely make sure that I make a stop over at Columbia University. And
wonderful.
And
let's meet in New York, Bloemfontein, or Cape Town. All of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds good.
I'm now going to hand over to Sharon just to pick up some questions that might have come from the floor. Sharon, over to you.
Thank you very much. And could I add London to the destination of
Of
meeting
course.
list, please?
No question.
Thank you very much. Professor Petersen, you're welcome to stay on camera, because there may be a question you might want to contribute to as well. So by all means. I found that absolutely fascinating. I'm having messages coming from all quarters on other mediums as well, who are attending and thanking you for the insights and the interesting observations. And some of the things that sort of come to mind that I remember from what you were talking about is, and I thank you for being brave, that South Africa is not the only country in the world that has had apartheid. We're the ones that put it on the statute book. That was the mistake. It's wrong for apartheid to have happened in every respect, but we weren't a unique country.
Absolutely.
Having these problems that we should never have had. And it's always, we get such a black mark for it, and yet it's not us that are the only ones that cause it. So thank you for that. And the other aspect I found very brave in your commentary was your view of the press, your commentary on politicians, and the respective self-serving nature that human beings are, and therefore the role of the global citizen and what we have to do to influence those few that have so much influence, and it's not always the influence we might feel proud of. So I thank you for giving us that responsibility and helping us see that it is up to us. We cannot abdicate this responsibility to the powers that be because they're not wired that way. Humans are not wired that way. Particularly some of them are worse than others. And you mentioned a few, and I have to say I did have a few smiles behind my black face with my name on it. I did also correlate to the Stone Age medieval world, and I would translate your last one into the agile world. So very interesting there. And we have got a long way to go to 2050 to get ourselves into a cleaner place. One of the comments, there's a lot of questions. I won't be able to get through all of them, but I'd like to sort of pick some of the themes. And there's one around the, how do you feel for emerging markets? They've been through a pandemic as badly as the rest of the world, sometimes worse. How do you feel from a climate change? Where are they? Because they are suffering in exactly the same way, and they, in some cases, worse because they don't have an alternative to fossil fuels at this point in their emerging power cycle. And looking particularly at South Africa, where do you see the opportunities economically for the emerging markets in the world?
I think the whole green and digital agenda is a growth agenda. It means upfront investments in wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and digital connectivity, smart grid, electric vehicles. It's a lot of investment, a lot of aggregate demand, as we would say as macroeconomists, a lot of propulsion of the economy, but it requires access to financing. And the problem right now, as the IMF just showed in its mid-year economic report that it released a few days ago, the rich countries have spent about $17 trillion of COVID-related extra spending since the start of the pandemic. The emerging economies, less than $4 trillion for roughly 4 times more people. The low-income countries have spent less than $2 trillion because they don't have access to capital. So what's happened is the rich countries, even with the COVID going on, the US has bounced back to pre-COVID, and it's growing. It's growing fairly rapidly right now, and President Biden's trying to pass a green infrastructure. It'll have to be all Democrats because the Republicans are so pro-fossil fuel that they won't vote for it. But Biden is trying to pass a major piece of legislation in the coming weeks to move us in the needed green direction. My view is that the emerging economies could have a great decade of growth if, first of all, we get this immunization finally done, because we need to. And then second, if there's a lot more access to low interest financing so that South Africa and others can invest in the new clean energy economy, in the new digital economy. And for that, we need international financial system reform. Much more money going through development finance institutions, much more co-financing by rich countries that can borrow at near zero to help middle income emerging economies borrow a lot more, but at low interest rates, so that the debt is feasible and can be serviced for the future. So that's the kind of direction that I believe. There is a growth agenda, but it needs financing.
Thank you. And that is a challenge within itself, is to get the world to come together, which leads me on to one of the other questions I've seen in the list, which is, we talk about it. We talked about climate change for 10 years amongst an interested group and nothing happened. The pandemic came and investors alike, the man in the street, actually starting to understand and get a little bit more about climate change than they did before. How long are we going to talk about this aspect of the global citizen and our responsibility for our planet? Or is there a way we can change that and actually get things done?
You know, we've been talking about climate change at a high level actually for almost 30 years, because it was in
I didn't want to go that far back.
it was in 1992 that the world adopted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is still our governing legal document. Then in Kyoto in 1997, the countries adopted the Kyoto Protocol. And that said, let's get on a path of decarbonization. And then what happened? The US Senate voted 95-0. We won't do anything unless China does it at the same time. But under the agreement we had reached, the rich countries were supposed to go first. So we ended up with a stalemate. That stalemate actually lasted another 20 years till the Paris Climate Agreement. So the capacity to do nothing is astounding as the world got hotter and hotter and more unstable. One thing did happen that was positive, though, and that is that the cost of zero carbon alternatives came down, and it came down amazingly. The cost of photovoltaics, of solar electric, came down by factor 100 during this period. Largely, Germany bought a lot of solar panels and China manufactured a lot of them, and they drove down the price, the cost, remarkably. So there was a learning curve that helped us move forward. Now we have low-cost technologies. The planet has already warmed to a dangerous level. The scientists are telling us you must decarbonize by mid-century. The International Energy Agency this spring issued a report called Net Zero by 2050, and its headline conclusion, one sentence: stop all new fossil fuel projects. Stop. And that's really important message. So how long will we go on? We don't know. How long can we afford to go on? We can't go on talking anymore. And fortunately, Biden beat Trump. Biden called together 40 world leaders by Zoom. I like that also, because I think the world leaders should learn to Zoom the same way we do. They may get to know each other and they don't have to get on these expensive junkets to see each other. They can just talk to each other by Zoom like we're doing. And at that meeting, they basically said, yes, we need to get to zero. And if the US would cooperate with China, this would be a huge breakthrough, because China's about 28% of the total emissions. The United States is about 14%, about half of China. Mind you, twice per person and 1/2 in total, because China's 4 times larger than the US. But if the two countries did it together, and the European Union and the UK have all said zero by 2050, we'd actually be on our way. And if we helped Africa with sensible financing, I've just written a study for the African Development Bank showing Africa at low cost can reach zero. There's so much good sunshine, obviously, so much hydropower, 100 gigawatts on the Congo Basin alone. The Sahel, which is an impoverished region, is probably the best sunshine on the whole planet. And so if we could get the investments, we could really move forward continental scale in Africa to get clean energy, but not just clean energy for everybody. Because right now, most people in rural areas do not have electrification in Africa. And this is shocking, but it's completely solvable.
A last question along the lines of very quite specifically the global citizen. If we're looking at the global citizen and we're looking at the global citizen in a business context and in an individual context. How can we work together with governments, between business and government collaboration? And if we take that to a bigger global view of it, the Global Business Coalition, previously the B20, and how that could interface with the does and could more with the G20. I worry, that still sounds like talking shops. How can we do things in this space, but how can we get some outcomes?
We need action, and action means money. So we need to make sure that we're talking about real money, real financing on the table, and not just let words be out there floating without the money that needs to go along with them. We need to say to our governments, stop fighting, get onto the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement, work together with civil society and business, put the real money behind it. We know it's there. We know that if 3 gazillionaires can take a 10-minute trip to outer space, and they have hundreds of billions of dollars of personal wealth between them, this planet is plenty wealthy enough to actually achieve sustainable development. And so this is what we need to do. And we're going to have, I hope, and I'm counting on it, a G21 to get this done, because that's really going to help to bring 1.4 billion Africans to the table so that we have representation that really is fair and inclusive. And then we need to treat this as the emergency that it is. End the pandemic and get on a new, safe path to global, inclusive, sustainable development.
I couldn't sum that up better if I tried. So I shan't try and sum up better. But what I do see in all your messages that you've brought to us, whether it be pandemic related, economies related, sustainable around your climate side, long term, it all comes back to there is money. How do we unlock it? How do we get those people and or governments and or organizations to believe in the giving back at this point to our global society to be sustainable, so that we don't have to suffer global viruses that can take us over in 16 days or whatever it was you told us. And it is frighteningly fascinating how quickly this has happened. I think it's woken us all up. So yes, I'll stay hiding where I am, but you told me that's no good. But I have done my double vaccination, and I did find your correlation between being vaccinated and the attitude towards carbon and carbon relationship is of not doing anything. So I did find that a good smile as well. We are coming up for time. Professor Petersen, is there a last word from you that you would like to give?
Yes, thank you, Sharon. I just wanted to say thank you to Professor Sachs for this entertaining conversation. I think it was fantastic. The emphasis back on what is the responsibility for all of us as global citizens, and specifically in an environment where we are as a university, and also where you are, where one of our roles are to develop, educate and train our next generation of global citizens. These messages are tremendously key and impactful. And I just would like to say thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that. And also to you, Sharon, for hosting us and for creating this platform so that we can have a much more global reach. Thank you.
Let me add my thanks to both of you also for a wonderful time to be together, and let's keep pushing ahead.
Absolutely.
And the other message I see, just in something you said, Francis, was just following on the thoughts from a moment before. I might not have the money, but I might have the will to discuss it. I might have the will to encourage others. It is everybody's responsibility. It doesn't belong to the people who've got deep pockets only or have nothing better to do with their time. It is for all of us to take this one in hand. And thank you very much to both of you. It's been a fascinating talk. Francis, I know we have one more, I think, in the bag to come in this fascinating series. And Professor Sachs, it's been an honor to meet you. And I do understand that Tolkien was also born in Bloemfontein. So you have some other famous people that hail from your part of the world.
Very wonderful. Very good.
Fantastic.
Thanks you very much to everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.